I didn't know why I agreed to go into the old building. Maybe it was the thrill of doing something forbidden, or maybe it was just to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. The place had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, standing tall and dark at the edge of town like a decaying giant. People said it was haunted, but I didn't believe in ghosts. At least not then. It was a cloudy night when I decided to go. The moon was hidden behind thick layers of clouds, casting a dim, eerie light on everything. I could hear the wind whistling through the trees as I walked down the dirt path that led to the building. The closer I got, the more my heart pounded, but I told myself it was just nerves. I wasn't scared. I couldn't be. The entrance was a gaping hole where the front door used to be. The wood had rotted away, leaving splinters and jagged edges. I took a deep breath, stepped inside, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the building itself was holding its breath. My footsteps echoed as I moved through the first room. Dust covered everything, a thick, choking layer that made it hard to see what was beneath. Old furniture, broken and forgotten, was scattered around like the remains of a once lively place. The walls were peeling, revealing the bones of the building beneath. A faint smell of mildew and rot hung in the air. I moved slowly, trying to take in every detail. Something was unsettling about the silence, as if the building was waiting for something. Every creak of the floorboards under my weight made me flinch. I kept telling myself it was just an old building, nothing more. But deep down, something didn't feel right. I walked through a narrow hallway, the walls closing in on me. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath. I tapped it a few times and the light steadied. I could see the end of the hallway now, a door slightly ajar. I don't know what made me push it open, but I did. The room beyond was larger, emptier. The windows were broken, and the wind howled through them, making the curtains dance like they were alive. I shined my light around the room, and that's when I saw it. In the far corner, a shadow moved, slowly, deliberately. At first I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then it moved again and I realized it wasn't the wind. The shadow had a shape, a form that was almost human, but not quite. It was darker than the night, like a piece of the building had broken off and come to life. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadowy figure stood still, watching me. It had no eyes, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It slid across the floor without a sound, coming closer, and I finally found the strength to turn and run. I dashed down the hallway, my flashlight bouncing in my hand. The shadow seemed to stretch, reaching for me as I fled. I could hear something behind me, a soft rustling that grew louder and closer with every step. I stumbled through the rooms, tripping over debris and broken furniture. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't dare stop. The building felt like a maze, twisting and turning, leading me in circles. I could feel the walls closing in, the darkness pressing down on me. Finally, I saw the exit, the hole where the front door used to be. I threw myself through it, falling onto the dirt outside. The cold night air hit me like a wave, and I scrambled to my feet, looking back at the building. The shadowy figure was standing just inside, watching me. It didn't follow, but I could feel its presence, like a weight on my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back on the main road, my legs burning and my lungs screaming for air. Only then did I slow down, looking back at the building one last time. It was just a dark shape against the night sky, silent and still. But I knew what I had seen. I never went back to that place, and I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes when the night is quiet and the wind is still, I can feel that cold gaze on me again, as if the shadow never really let me go. It's a feeling that sends a chill down my spine, reminding me of that night and the darkness that lives just on the edge of the light. I've been a truck driver for over 10 years, spending most of my life on the road. The highway has always been my second home. Long, endless roads, the hum of the engine, and the steady rhythm of the wheels beneath me. But this night was different, one that would stay with me forever. It was late, maybe around 2 in the morning, and I was driving through a remote stretch of road. The sky was pitch black, with only the occasional flash of headlights from oncoming cars. The road was empty, as it usually was at this hour. My eyes were heavy, and the monotonous landscape wasn't helping. I had been driving for hours and was looking forward to the next rest stop, which was still about 50 miles away. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something in the distance. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was standing by the side of the road, alone in the dark. He wore a long, dark coat that seemed too heavy for the warm summer night. His head was down and his hair hung limply over his face. There was something off about him. I could feel it, but I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just my imagination. As a truck driver, I'd seen plenty of strange things on the road. Maybe he was just a hitchhiker. I slowed down as I approached him, not because I wanted to pick him up, but out of curiosity. There was no way anyone should be out here at this hour, miles away from the nearest town. My truck rolled to a stop a few feet away from him. For a moment I considered driving away, but something made me hesitate. He didn't move. He just stood there, as if he hadn't noticed me at all. I honked the horn, a short, loud blast. His head jerked up, and for the first time, I saw his face. My breath caught in my throat. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were wide, empty, and lifeless. There was a strange look in them, something that made me want to drive away as fast as I could. But then he moved. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed down the road, as if asking for a ride. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the gas pedal. Every instinct told me to leave, but something in his eyes held me in place. It was as if he was pleading with me, begging for help. Against my better judgment, I opened the passenger door, unsure why I was doing it. He climbed in without a word, his movements slow and deliberate. The door closed with a soft click, and the truck suddenly felt much smaller, the air thick with tension. I tried to start a conversation, but he remained silent, staring straight ahead. His presence was unnerving. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we drove, I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and I noticed they were covered in dirt. Or was it something else? I couldn't tell in the dim light, but it looked dark, almost like dried blood. My heart started pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The road stretched on, and the silence between us grew heavier. I felt trapped in my truck, my mind racing with thoughts of who this man could be. Was he in trouble, or was I the one in danger? The night seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper. The headlights only illuminated a small patch of road ahead, leaving the rest of the world in pitch-black darkness. The man hadn't moved or spoken since he got in. His eyes were fixed on the road, but I couldn't tell if he was seeing anything. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to break the silence. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice shaky. He didn't respond. I tried again, louder this time, but still nothing. It was as if he didn't hear me, or maybe he didn't want to answer. Then, out of nowhere, he turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. They were dark, bottomless pits that seemed to suck the light out of the cab. I had never seen eyes like that before, and I hope I never do again. Suddenly he grinned, a twisted, unnatural smile that sent a wave of fear crashing over me. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white. I didn't know what he was, but I knew I had to get away. I pressed down on the gas, my truck speeding up. The engine roared and the truck lurched forward, but the man's smile didn't fade. He leaned closer, his breath hot on my skin. I could feel his eyes boring into me, even though I couldn't bring myself to look at him. The rest stop was only a few miles away. I focused on that, on the lights I could just barely see in the distance. If I could just make it there, I'd be safe. But the road seemed to stretch on forever, the lights never getting any closer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the rest stop appeared on the horizon. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of fear. The man hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but I could feel his presence growing stronger, more oppressive. As I pulled into the rest stop, I slammed on the brakes and threw the truck into park. The man turned to me, his smile gone, replaced by that same empty stare. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was frozen with fear. Then, without a word, he opened the door and stepped out into the night. He didn't look back as he walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I sat there, staring at the open door, my heart racing. It took me a long time to calm down, to convince myself that it was over. But even now, when I'm driving alone at night, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for his next ride. We decided to go camping deep in the woods, away from the crowded trails and noise of the city. The weekend promised clear skies, and the idea of being surrounded by nature, with nothing but the rustle of leaves and the songs of birds, seemed like the perfect escape. My friend Jake and I had been planning this trip for months, carefully selecting a spot far from civilization where we could truly disconnect. We arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the dense forest. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. We strapped on our backpacks, heavy with supplies, and began our hike. The trail was narrow, winding through towering trees whose branches intertwined above, creating a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of the outside world faded away. The only noise was the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional call of a distant bird. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees growing taller and denser, their bark rough and ancient. After several hours of hiking, we found a clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was a small open space surrounded by thick trees, with a soft bed of moss underfoot. The clearing felt almost hidden, a secret spot untouched by other campers. We pitched our tent, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest around us transformed. The chirping of birds gave way to the chorus of crickets, their steady rhythm blending with the crackle of our campfire. The flames flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the trees, and the warmth of the fire felt comforting against the cool night air. We ate our dinner, chatting about nothing in particular, enjoying the solitude and the simple pleasure of being away from everything. The night deepened, the sky above a blanket of stars, and we decided to turn in, eager for a good night's sleep after the long hike. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the forest was eerily quiet. For a moment I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a faint sound just outside the tent. It was like the soft crunch of something moving over the forest floor. I sat up, my heart beginning to race. Jake was still asleep beside me, breathing deeply. The sound came again, closer this time. I listened carefully, trying to identify what it could be. An animal, perhaps, a deer or a fox. But something about it felt off. It made my skin prickle with unease. I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peeked outside. The forest was dark, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I scanned the clearing, looking for the source of the sound, but saw nothing unusual. The fire's embers glowed faintly, casting a dim light, but there was no movement, no sign of anything out of place. Relieved, I started to pull the flap shut when something caught my eye. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, where the shadows of the trees were thickest, there were footprints. They were clear, unmistakable imprints in the soft earth leading toward our tent. My breath caught in my throat. They were too large to be from an animal, and too fresh to have been there before we set up camp. I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who could have made those prints? We hadn't seen anyone else all day, and we were miles from the nearest town. The thought of someone, or something, lurking in the darkness watching us sent a chill down my spine. I shook Jake awake, my voice barely above a whisper. He grumbled, rubbing his eyes, but when he saw the look on my face, he sat up, instantly alert. I pointed to the footprints, and his expression shifted from confusion to alarm. We sat in silence, listening for any sound, any sign that we weren't alone. That's when we heard it, the chanting. It was distant at first, so faint that we might have missed it if we weren't straining to hear. A low, rhythmic murmur like a voice carried on the wind. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unsettling, a monotonous drone that seemed to seep into the very air around us. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, though the words were still incomprehensible. It was coming from the direction of the footprints, from the dense woods just beyond our camp. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. We exchanged a glance, both of us too scared to speak. The chanting was getting closer, more intense, and with it came a sense of dread that hung heavy in the air. Then, through the darkness, we saw him. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of our dying fire. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes ragged and filthy, hanging off him like tattered rags. His hair was long and matted, obscuring most of his face, but what I could see in his eyes was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. They were hollow and empty, as if there was nothing human behind them. He stood there, swaying slightly, his lips moving in that same eerie chant. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words, whatever they were, seemed to vibrate in the air, filling the clearing with an unnatural energy. Jake and I were frozen in place, unable to move, unable to tear our eyes away from the figure. For what felt like an eternity, he just stood there, muttering to himself, his eyes unfocused. Then, without warning, he lunged at us, his arms outstretched, his chant turning into a guttural scream. We scrambled backward, tripping over each other in our panic. Jake grabbed a branch from the fire, brandishing it like a weapon, the embers flaring to life as he swung it at the man. The figure recoiled, a low growl escaping his throat. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, his hollow eyes flickering with some unreadable emotion. Then, with a final haunting whisper, he turned and fled back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as he had appeared. We didn't wait to see if he would return. We grabbed what we could carry and bolted, leaving our tent and most of our gear behind. We ran through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, the chanting still echoing faintly in our ears. When we finally reached the trailhead, exhausted and terrified, we collapsed on the ground, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that we felt safe enough to move again. We reported the incident to the authorities, but they didn't seem surprised. They told us about the man, how he had been living in the woods for years, performing strange rituals, targeting campers who wandered too far into his territory. We never went back to the woods, to that forest. Even now, years later, the memory of that night sends a chill down my spine. The man, his hollow eyes and the haunting chant still linger in my mind, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. The rain came down hard that night, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers drumming on a table. Each droplet seemed to be in a race, sliding down the glass in erratic patterns, while my breath fogged up the cold surface as I pressed my face closer. My parents had left in a hurry, muttering something about an emergency at work. They promised they'd be back soon, but as the hours dragged on, the weight of the empty house seemed to grow, pressing down on me with an almost physical force. It wasn't the first time I'd been left alone, but tonight felt different. Like the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. The storm outside was relentless, the wind howling like a wild animal. It shook the trees, sending their branches clattering against the windows, and the occasional crack of thunder made the entire house shudder. The darkness outside felt thicker than usual, more oppressive, as if it were seeping into the walls of the house, and every creak and groan of the old structure set my nerves on edge. I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but the static flickering on the screen only added to the eerie atmosphere. The lights flickered now and then, as if the power was teetering on the brink of failure. A sudden knock at the door jolted me out of my uneasy thoughts. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be out in this weather? The storm was too fierce for anyone to be wandering around. I hesitated, clutching the remote tightly, my mind racing through possible scenarios. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Slowly, I got up and crept towards the door, my footsteps barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. Peeking through the peephole, I saw a figure standing on the porch, a woman, drenched to the bone, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin. At first, I didn't recognize her, but then it clicked, the new neighbor who had moved in a few houses down. We'd exchanged polite greetings a few days ago, but that was it. Now, here she was, in the middle of a storm, standing on my doorstep. I opened the door just a crack enough to see her face clearly. Her eyes were wide, almost wild, and her soaked hair was plastered to her forehead. She gave me a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile that sent a shiver down your spine. "Are you alone?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. The question caught me off guard. Why would she ask that? Something about her tone, the intensity in her gaze, was deeply unsettling. My mouth went dry and I could barely manage a nod. Her head tilted slightly, studying me, as if she were trying to decide something. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness and the pounding rain. I shut the door quickly, locking it behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, the echo of her question ringing in my ears. What did she mean by that? Was she just concerned? Or was there something more sinister behind her words? I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, just a neighbor checking in during a storm. But the way she vanished into the night without looking back didn't sit right with me. Back in the living room, I couldn't focus on the TV. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting her to come back or for something else to happen. The storm raged on, the relentless pounding of the rain against the windows a constant reminder of my isolation. Time passed slowly. An hour, maybe more, and I started to relax, convincing myself that my imagination was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it. Footsteps, faint at first, just a soft creaking sound above me. I froze, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, as if someone was walking slowly and deliberately across the floor upstairs. I knew I was alone in the house. My parents wouldn't be back for hours and no one else had a key. The realization sent a chill down my spine. The footsteps continued, moving from one room to the next, like someone, or something, was searching for something. My breath hitched, panic surging through me. I bolted from the living room, heading for the front door, but before I reached it, the footsteps stopped. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I forced myself to look back towards the staircase, half expecting to see a shadowy figure at the top. But there was nothing, just the dark hallway stretching into the shadows. Gathering every ounce of courage, I slowly crept up the stairs, each step feeling like an eternity. The air felt thick, heavy with an unspoken tension. When I reached the top, I hesitated, listening. Everything was silent. I turned towards my parents' bedroom, the door slightly ajar, and pushed it open. Inside, two men stood with their backs to me, dressed in dark clothes. They were rifling through the drawers, pulling out items and tossing them aside. My heart stopped. I didn't recognize them, and the sight of them filled me with a cold, paralyzing fear. They hadn't noticed me yet, and I knew I had to act fast. Spinning on my heel, I ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Behind me, I heard them shout and give chase. Their footsteps thundered down the hall, matching the rhythm of my pounding heart. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to get out, to escape. I reached the front door, fumbling with the lock, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. The door flew open, and I stumbled outside into the rain, the cold drops hitting me like needles. I ran down the street, not stopping until I was halfway to a neighbor's house. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called the police. My voice was barely coherent as I tried to explain what had happened. By the time the police arrived, the men were gone. The house was empty, save for the signs of their search, drawers left open, belongings scattered. But there was no trace of the intruders, no clues as to who they were or what they wanted. As I stood in the rain, watching the officers move through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The storm might pass, but the terror of that night would stay with me forever. The storm raged outside as I drove home from my late-night shift. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the relentless rain, barely making a dent in the sheets of water pouring down. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the empty road ahead. It was one of those nights where you feel completely alone, the world outside reduced to nothing but the sound of rain and the hum of the engine. I was tired, exhausted. My shift had been long, and all I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. The road twisted and turned through the countryside, lined with tall trees that bent under the weight of the storm. Lightning occasionally lit up the sky, momentarily illuminating the landscape before plunging it back into darkness. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a figure standing by the side of the road. A man, drenched to the bone, holding out his thumb for a ride. He looked desperate, his clothes clinging to his body, water streaming down his face. I slowed down, my heart racing. I knew it wasn't safe to pick up hitchhikers, especially in the middle of the night. But something about the way he stood there shivering in the rain tugged at my conscience. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the brake. The thought of leaving him out there in the storm felt cruel, but the idea of letting a stranger into my car filled me with unease. For a moment I considered driving past, but then I imagined how I would feel if I were in his position, cold, wet, and stranded in the middle of nowhere. I sighed and pulled over, the tires crunching on the wet gravel. The man approached the car, his face obscured by the shadows. I leaned over and unlocked the passenger door, my hands trembling slightly. "Thanks," he muttered as he climbed in, shaking off the rain. "No problem," I replied, forcing a smile. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road. There's a gas station. You can drop me off there," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I nodded and pulled back onto the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The man sat silently beside me, staring straight ahead. His presence was unsettling, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The car felt smaller with him in it, the air thick with tension. The rain pounded on the roof, drowning out any attempt at conversation. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was tall, with dark hair plastered to his forehead. His clothes were simple, nothing out of the ordinary, but there was something off about him. His face was pale, his eyes dark and unreadable. Minutes passed in silence, the only sound the rhythmic thud of the wipers. My unease grew with each passing second. I could feel his eyes on me, even though he never turned his head. It was as if he was studying me, waiting for something. My skin prickled with a sense of impending dread, and I kept my gaze firmly on the road, resisting the urge to look back at him. Finally, the gas station came into view, its neon lights flickering through the rain. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the lot. I had never been so happy to see a run-down, isolated gas station in my life. "This is it," the man said, breaking the silence. I nodded, pulling up to the entrance. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain without another word. As he closed the door, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I was alone again, and the feeling of dread began to dissipate. I took a deep breath and put the car in gear, ready to drive away, but something caught my eye. There, on the passenger seat, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. I hadn't noticed him leave anything behind, but it was unmistakably there, a damp note sitting on the fabric. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up, unfolding it with trembling hands. The note was hastily scrawled, the ink slightly smudged from the rain. "Check the back seat," it read. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned my head toward the back seat, my heart hammering in my chest. The car was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the gas station sign. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but I could make out the shape of the empty seat behind me. My hands shook as I turned back around, my mind racing. Had he been playing a sick joke? Had there been someone else in the car with us? My skin crawled at the thought, and I quickly locked the doors, my fingers fumbling with the button. I stared out at the rain, my pulse pounding in my ears. The gas station's neon lights flickered in the storm, casting eerie shadows across the lot. I wanted to drive away, to leave this place behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced at the note again, my stomach twisting. The man had seemed strange but harmless, at least at first. Why would he leave a warning like that? And why did I feel like I wasn't alone? I swallowed hard and forced myself to take a deep breath. Maybe it was all in my head, the product of a long night and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something had been wrong from the moment I picked that man up. I threw the note onto the passenger seat and shifted the car into drive, my hands still shaking. I needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between myself and that gas station as possible. As I pulled away, the rain intensified, the storm raging on as if it would never end. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the shadows of the back seat. The road stretched out before me, dark and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. Even as I drove away, the memory of that note lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder of the man I had picked up, and the man I had never seen. I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to escape the darkness that seemed to follow me even now. I've always believed cemeteries are places of peace. They're where we say our final goodbyes, where the dead find rest, and where the living can reflect on those who have passed. For years, I visited the grave of my late wife, Eliza, every Sunday. It was a ritual, a way to feel close to her even though she was no longer in this world. I found comfort in those quiet moments, speaking to her as if she were still there, sharing my thoughts and keeping her memory alive. But on one particular visit, something happened that still haunts me to this day. It was late afternoon when I arrived at the cemetery. The sky was overcast, a dull gray blanket of clouds that seemed to mute the world. The sun was hidden, casting a cold, dim light over the rows of tombstones. The wind was unusually sharp for that time of year, cutting through my jacket and chilling me to the bone. I parked at the entrance and began the familiar walk down the gravel path, the crunch of my footsteps the only sound breaking the silence. As I neared Eliza's grave, I noticed something strange. A man stood a few rows away, his figure a dark silhouette against the gray sky. He wasn't facing any particular grave, just standing there staring in my direction. I'd never seen him before, and his presence made me uneasy. It wasn't uncommon to see others visiting, but there was something off about this man. His stillness, the way he seemed to be watching me. I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on clearing the fallen leaves from Eliza's grave. Kneeling, I spoke to her as I always did, sharing updates about my week, the kids, and how much I missed her. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the man hadn't moved. His presence felt wrong, intrusive, as though he were waiting for something. After finishing my conversation with Eliza, I stood up, ready to leave. But when I glanced in the man's direction, I realized he was closer, much closer. My heart started to race. He had moved silently, now standing only a few yards away. His clothes were worn, dirty, and his eyes were wild, glinting with an unsettling intensity. "Got any money?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. It wasn't a polite question. It was a demand. His tone sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew immediately that this was no ordinary encounter. There was a menace in his eyes, a desperation that made my stomach churn. "I don't have any cash on me," I replied, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. It was the truth. I never carried cash when visiting Eliza's grave. There was never a need to. He didn't believe me. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "Don't lie to me," he hissed. "Everyone's got something. Give it to me." I shook my head, backing away instinctively. "I really don't have anything," I insisted, my voice firmer now. But my heart was pounding, and I could feel the panic rising. The man's posture stiffened, his fists clenching at his sides. He wasn't just looking for money. This was something more dangerous. His eyes were wild with a mix of anger and something else, something primal. The stillness of the cemetery suddenly felt suffocating, the tombstones around us like silent witnesses to the unfolding threat. I glanced around, hoping for some sign of life, someone else who could help. But the cemetery was empty. It was just me and this man, standing in the cold, oppressive quiet. The wind howled through the trees, but it didn't mask the tension in the air. "Give me what you've got," he demanded again, his voice rising. He was growing more agitated, more dangerous. My options were shrinking by the second. "I'm leaving now," I said, trying to sound calm, though my voice wavered. I took a cautious step to the side, attempting to slip past him, but he moved with me, blocking my path. His presence was overwhelming, a looming threat in the desolate cemetery. "I'm warning you," he growled, his tone low and menacing. He took another step forward, and I could see the madness in his eyes, a dangerous glint that made my blood run cold. I knew I couldn't reason with him. He wasn't going to let me go without a fight. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My instincts took over, propelling me down the gravel path. I could hear him shouting behind me, his footsteps pounding against the ground as he gave chase. The wind whipped against my face, and the world around me seemed to blur as I sprinted towards the safety of my car. Reaching it, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling so violently that it took several attempts to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locking the doors and starting the engine in one frantic motion. My eyes darted around, searching for the man, but he was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I drove straight to the police station, my mind racing, my heart still pounding. I recounted the encounter in detail, describing the man, his threats, and my narrow escape. The officers listened, nodding, but I could tell they were skeptical. "People visit cemeteries all the time," they said. Maybe it was just a homeless man looking for a handout. A few days later, I received a call from the police. They had found the man I described, but he wasn't alive. His body had been discovered in the cemetery beneath a broken grave. His neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. There were no clear signs of how he had died or how he ended up under that grave. It was as if the earth itself had claimed him. The police asked me if I knew anything more, if I had seen anyone else that day, but I hadn't. It had been just me and him, standing among the graves. Now I still visit Eliza's grave, but only during the day when the sun is high and the world feels less threatening. Yet even in the daylight, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, or I feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. And at night, in the quiet of my home, I dream of wild eyes and hear that gravelly voice demanding what I cannot give. My name is Kevin, and I used to work the night shift at a small office downtown. It wasn't a bad job, quiet and simple. I managed files, updated reports, and made sure everything was ready for the morning crew. Most of the time, I was alone in the building, which was fine with me. I enjoyed the peace and didn't mind the silence. But one night changed everything. It was a regular Wednesday evening, and I was sitting at my desk, staring at the bright light of my laptop screen. The office was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from my desk lamp and the glow of the computer. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound filling the space. I had grown used to these nights, the long hours stretching into the early morning. It was around midnight when things started to feel strange. At first I thought I was just tired. My eyes were heavy, and my head was starting to ache from staring at the screen for too long. But then I noticed something odd on my laptop. As I typed, the reflection on the screen caught my attention. At first, it was just my face staring back at me, but then I saw something else. A faint shadow, almost like someone was standing behind me. I blinked a few times thinking it was just my imagination, but the figure remained. I quickly turned around, expecting to see a coworker who had maybe come in late, but there was no one there. The office was empty, just like it always was at this hour. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was just tired. I shook my head and got back to work, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping up on me. But I couldn't focus. Every few minutes I would glance at the screen, and each time I saw the same shadowy figure. It didn't move, didn't change. It just stood there, right behind me, watching. I decided to take a break. I stood up from my desk and walked around the office, hoping that stretching my legs would help me shake off the strange feeling. The hallways were quiet, the only sound coming from the hum of the vending machine in the break room. I grabbed a bottle of water and walked back to my desk, feeling slightly better. But as soon as I sat down, the feeling returned. The shadow was back. This time it was clearer, taller, and more defined. It looked like a person standing right behind my chair, but when I turned around again, there was no one. The air felt heavier now, like something was watching me, waiting. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. I decided to finish up my work quickly and leave. The faster I could get out of there, the better. I focused on the screen, my fingers moving quickly over the keyboard, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. But then, the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a small flicker in the corner of the room. But then it happened again, stronger this time. The overhead lights blinked once, twice, and then went out, leaving me in near darkness. The only light left was the soft glow of my laptop screen. That's when I saw it. The figure wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was clear now. A dark, ghostly figure standing directly behind me. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard, too afraid to move. The figure didn't move either, but I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, like it was waiting for something. My breathing became shallow and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Slowly, I reached out and touched the edge of the laptop, hoping that if I closed it, the figure would disappear. But as soon as my fingers brushed the screen, the figure moved. It stepped closer, its outline becoming clearer. I could almost see its face now, pale and blurred, like something out of a nightmare. My heart raced, and without thinking, I jumped up from my chair, knocking it over in the process. I didn't stop to look back. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing through the empty office. As I reached the hallway, I glanced back one last time, and I saw it, standing at my desk, looking directly at me through the dark. I didn't slow down until I was outside, the cold night air hitting my face as I stumbled onto the sidewalk. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. It felt unreal, like a bad dream, but the fear was too real to ignore. I stood outside the building for a few minutes, catching my breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back in there. The next morning, I sent an email to my boss resigning from the job. I didn't give a reason, I didn't need to. I just knew I couldn't spend another night in that office, not after what I had seen. To this day, I still don't know what that figure was. Maybe it was a ghost, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after too many late nights. But whatever it was, it made sure I never set foot in that office again.